sometime during your career as a writer, in fact, probably quite often, you're going to find yourself writing in a genre. Now, I'd advise that if you're starting off writing in genre, probably choose a genre that you already enjoy. Yes, you can move on to other genres later, but find something that you're genuinely excited about before you go plunging in to this extremely fertile undergrowth. Where does genre come from? Well, actually, it kind of comes, as with most of the important things in this world, from Northampton. Genre has grown out of the Gothic movement. The Gothic movement has grown out of the graveyard poetry movement. The graveyard poetry movement has grown out of the writings of the miserable but very eloquent Northampton divine James Hervey. He wrote such incredibly morbid but beautiful pieces of writing about funeral processions with the cerements blowing on the breeze, which, Jesus Christ, they were really depressing but beautifully worded. And he became the best writer in John Wesley's Holy Club, as it was called. He was then thrown out for hanging around with evangelicals, but his writing was so extraordinary and pervasive. He could write so beautifully about how only God was eternal and that all of the flesh would eventually decay and fall away. This was lovely. And then you got the first graveyard poets who thought, oh, this is fantastic stuff. I wonder if you could write this sort of stuff as poetry. And so they wrote the graveyard poems, the things like Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, where they were talking about the things that you find in graveyards, the skulls, the bats, the tombstones, and how these are all symbols of how the flesh and the material world will all fall away and there will only be the eternal, immortal glory of God. Now, some people read these graveyard poems and they thought, yeah, actually, I'm not all that fussed about this God business, but now the bats and the skulls, that is fantastic. So you got the later graveyard poems. The later graveyard poets were frankly ghoulish. They were loving all of this stuff. The bones, the skulls, the bats, everything. Then you've got writers like Horace Walpole. Horace Walpole reads the later graveyard poems and he really loves all of this miserable, ghoulish stuff. And he thinks, I wonder if you could write a novel based upon this kind of thing. And so the Gothic novel is invented. And it scandalises literature, which up until that point had been the comedy of manners, like Sheridan or Jane Austen. This was seen as being the only genre that could be considered literature, that everything else was sensational and ghastly and should not be considered to be proper writing. Despite the fact that actually genre is where literature gets all of its energy and its vitality from, it has been excluded beyond the security fence of literature. Working in genre is quite a heady experience. As I said, you should always go with a genre that you know something about. Because, say for example, that is the crime genre. Then you will be well acquainted with all of the aspects of the crime drama. You will know all of the cliches. You will know about the heart-stopping but ultimately treacherous blonde that tells the world-weary private eye a story to get him involved in the action, but inevitably she'll betray him. You know all of these little things that occur in most detective stories. So you can play against them. You can do the exact opposite. You can bend genre. You can break genre. Now, at the beginning of your career, this is the best thing to do. However, you might, at some point, want to move beyond genre into something that more resembles real life. At that point, then, when you have matured as a writer, why not try mashing all of the genres up together in the way that real life actually works? That in real life, we are not separated into tragedies and comedies and romances and science fiction dramas. They're all happening at once every day of our lives. We are in a soap opera that can easily turn to a mystery story or a hard-boiled piece of crime fiction or a science fiction story or any other form of narrative, and they're all happening at once. So this is what you can do with genre. Genre is a set of restrictions. It's a set of border walls or cage bars around different areas of literature. But breaking down those bars, smashing down those walls, gives you an incredible release of energy that can fuel your stories. An important consideration in writing your story, probably as important as deciding what genre it is deciding which mode in which to tell it. Now, on one level, this can be the most simple decision. Do you want to tell it as a comedy in a comedic mode, or do you want to tell it as a drama in a dramatic mode? I think that you'll find that almost any story that you've ever heard of could have been told in the opposite mode. It would have made it a completely different story, but the most horrific things, the most dramatic things, could have quite easily been comedies with a slight shift of emphasis. I think that it's worth remembering that comedy and horror, say, are actually working on the same principle. Both of them regard setting up a bunch of expectations which you will then basically disappoint the listener by moving beyond those expectations. As an example, say in the joke by Tommy Cooper, and my apologies if you haven't heard this one already, but a man walks into a bar, he breaks his arm. Now, what Tommy Cooper has done there is to set up an expectation that means one sort of bar. But no, he's using a different sort of bar, which results in the person breaking his arm when he walks into it. It's a betrayal of expectations for comic effect. And I know that explaining a joke like this kills any joke stone dead, so please bear with me. Now, the same thing is done in a horror narrative where it sets up a set of expectations, but will then surprise the reader in a way that is not humorous, in a way that is actually startling and frightening, perhaps. In fact, the horror narrative and the humour narrative, they slide very easily between each other. You will have probably noticed, if you've ever gone to see a horror film in a cinema, how many of the audience are laughing, if only as a release of tension, and how sometimes a horrific effect can be so over the top that the only possible reaction is to laugh. These things are very, very close to each other, almost side by side. So the mode of a story is massively important. Now, on another level, this is the decision, what tense is the story going to be in? Is it going to be in the past tense or in the present tense? Yeah, all right, it's possible to write a story in the future tense, but I wouldn't advise it. Your main choices are past and present. Now, past is the one that is most generally used. perhaps the easiest one. Its advantages are that it's very comfortable upon the ear, it's very non-threatening, there's a sense of distance there. You're telling a story that happened perhaps a long time ago. With a present tense narrative, it's completely different. There is much more immediacy, there is much more engagement. It is somehow more electric to have these things happening in the present. Now, also, as well as the tense that you're telling these things in, you should consider the person that you are telling them in. A lot of writers will probably go for the third person. The third person, he, she, it. That's very useful. That is probably the most broadly useful person to write in, because the third person is omniscient. The third person is an author's voice that already knows everything about the story. So the third person narrator can suddenly switch to something that's happening 100 miles away without the character's knowledge. The third person can jump all over the place and is not restricted to what a single character knows or experiences. However, the first person, that is very immediate, very powerful. It puts you right inside the character. And while it is perhaps more difficult, it does allow for some really nice literary tricks. It allows for the possibility of an unreliable narrator. Now, unreliable narrators are marvellous fun. It's a kind of misdirection, what we were talking about earlier. One of the masters of this kind of narrator would be Jim Thompson, the crime writer. I can remember in one of his books, he has got a law officer who is the first person narrator. And by about 10 pages in, you start to realise that this law officer is psychopathic, that he hates everybody, that he is trying to belittle and scare everybody that he talks to, that he thinks that the rest of the world is composed of scum. He is a monster. But this is something that only dawns upon you slowly as a reader and is a very creepy experience. I remember another Jim Thompson book where his narrator tells about a brutal bit of domestic abuse where he had pushed his wife into a full bath. Later, perhaps a couple of chapters later, he tells the story again. This time, it's a good-natured bit of joshing and fooling around that ended amusingly when his wife had slipped accidentally and landed in the bath. How they'd both laughed. And you realise he's lying to us now. He's lying to himself now. He is editing his past. This is a fantastic insight into a character that makes you feel very close to the story. You've figured out something about the character from the way that they talk, from the way that they express things. You have made this revelation. Now, we've talked about the first-person narrative, which allows you an intimacy with the character. And we've talked about the third-person narrative, which allows you that omniscience that a third-person narrator can have, where they know everything that's happening in the world of the story. But there is a third alternative, which is very, very useful. This is the close third person. It's where, you're talking in the third person about somebody. You're saying, he walks down the street, she goes to the laundry, she does this and that, but you're so close to the person that you can hear their thoughts. As an example from my own work, in the incredibly big, impractically big novel Jerusalem, in the second chapter, I have the main character is a crack-addicted sex worker called Marla, and Yes, it's a third-person narrative, but we're so close to her that we can hear her thoughts, and we can see how those thoughts run around a rat maze, from need to fear to anger, back to need again. We can be so close to her that we can hear her made up internal arguments where she's shouting in block capital letters at her mother, who isn't in the room with her and who she hasn't seen for 3 years. We can be right at the centre of this person's experience, and at the same time we can pull back and we can look at them from outside. This is basically having your cake and eating it too. It's having the best of both worlds, the close first person. Another thing that this is very useful towards is that it allows for something called free indirect discourse. What this is, it's a term that has just arisen from neurology, but what it means is you're giving the reader the opportunity to dip in and out of different people's consciousness. And what this does is it increases the reader's empathy. It enables the reader to see even inside a flawed or villainous character and to see why they did the things that they did. So, of course, an increase in empathy, it can really not be anything but a good thing, can it? And so, yes, person and tense, these are things that should be thought about. What kind of effect do you want to have upon your reader, and what would be the best mode to actually convey this?